And we're live. All right. And so, there we go. What we're going to do, there we go. What we're going to do is work through, ideally we'll work through all of the concepts from chapter 51 today. It may not happen, and that's okay. We have time on Wednesday to finish up chapter 51. And then we'll also get into 53 this week, which will be a little bit less familiar of material, but still starting in an area of this class that I think has a lot of places for you to make connections. If at any point you need me to explain something, please stop me. If you have a question, please feel free to let me know you have a question and to ask. Again, don't get into the habit of writing everything on the slide down because it's not helpful, okay? All right. So for example, on this slide, you really don't need to write anything down. It's an activity that we're going to do. And we did something like this on Thursday where we walked through the scientific method. And that's what's happening here. Here in this first point, this is the observation. Okay, and this observation is provided for us, but this is very easily an observation that you could make on your own. Fiddler crabs feed with their small claw and then wave their large claw. And this is really interesting because a lot of crabs, or think scorpions, right? They've got these massive, what you call pedipalps, okay? Or chelipeds, pedipalps, sorry, the feeding. I just told you something that is completely false. The chelipeds, but they've got these major pinchers, right? And scorpions, they use those to subdue prey. A lot of crabs use those to subdue prey. And yet we have these crabs that have one really small, one really large, which already looks weird because they look imbalanced. But then they feed with the small one and use the large one to wave around, right? Like, this is kind of strange. This is a weird phenomenon with this organism. And then so we move from observations to asking a research question. Why do male fiddler crabs engage in this claw-waving behavior? Seems strange. What are they doing? And so then you come up with a hypothesis, an answer to that question. And what are some key aspects of this hypothesis? So claw waving is used to repel other males and to attract females. What are some key characteristics of that hypothesis? What do you notice right away? Yeah.
There's two parts of it.
There are two parts of it, okay? So it's a two-part hypothesis, yeah.
Just like you see a lot of animals doing nature would be to attract females.
Okay, yeah, so it in some ways answers it based on what you see often in other animals, right? That a number of really unique features that don't seem to help them survive are just to attract females. That's true. Think of like a peacock tail, right? Certainly doesn't help it survive. Have you ever seen an image of a tiger or some kind of predator with its mouth around a peacock tail? Oh, you can find those pretty easily. It certainly doesn't help them survive, but it's used to attract females. Good. Yeah, so it relates to other features that we see in the animal kingdom. Anybody else see some key features? Let me ask you this. Does it answer the research question? Yes, it does, right? Then that's a key aspect of a hypothesis. It should answer the question you asked from your observations. Let me ask you this. Is it testable? Could you think about a way in which you could test this hypothesis?
Yeah.
How would you do it? So if this is your hypothesis, how would you test it? Yeah.
If you put a male crab and a female crab there, it seems like the female crab went swim and the male like went away.
Okay. Yeah, so expose your waver to both a male and a female crab and to see if the waving has any impact on male crabs and female crabs, right? Does it repel the male crab and does it attract the female crab? Good. Love it. Okay, so it's testable. Is it falsifiable? Like, could you prove this hypothesis wrong? Absolutely. And so this is a wonderful hypothesis. It answers your research question. It's testable. It's falsifiable. It's wonderful, right? And like Mark pointed out, it actually relates to a common feature that you find in other organisms. And so here is an image of a fiddler crab. So here you have the small claw used for feeding, and here you have the large claw. Not used for feeding, although it looks like it would be amazing, right? You're like, man, you could subdue anything with that. But really, they just kind of wave it around. And what you find is it actually is used to repel other males as an alternative to actually fighting. Physical combat is very rare in animals. Why does that make sense? Why does it make sense to actually make it to where animals fighting is a very rare occurrence? Yeah. There are much better ways to handle it, right? If you can fake like you're gonna fight, and then you give an opportunity to kind of size up, like one male fiddler crab's like, that's a really impressive claw. I don't know if I'm really ready to fight that male. You give an opportunity to still have that conflict and that competition without the subsequent injury that might come. Yeah, that's good. That's good. All right, and they do use it to attract females. Because males with the biggest claws are going to be able to ward off other males, and males with the biggest claws are going to produce other male offspring that are going to have big claws. Guys, come on. It's high school. Quit with the giggling. I'm just kidding. Yeah, oh no, I know. Yeah, and so one thing that you're going to find often with both behaviors and other features, if you have something different in males and females, it's almost always under the influence of sexual selection. It's almost always there because either the females choose males with that feature or males choose females with that feature. If you've got a difference in the males and females. All right, right? Think peacocks. Do you know what you call the female? Peahen. Okay, peahens don't have those really large, impressive tails, right? So what is that an indication of? Why do the males have them? Because it's under the influence of sexual selection. Females want that for some reason. But you know what's interesting? Japanese researchers put cameras on the heads of peahens, and they never actually look at the tail of a male. They never do it. They don't even notice it. So it makes you wonder, why do males actually have those? We'll come back to that in another time. All right. So just in general, what is a behavior? And so this may be something new to you, applying behavior in a new way. This might be something worth writing down on that 2/3. Behavior is the nervous system's response to some stimulus. This is one of our 4 big key ideas in this class. Animals responding or organisms responding to stimuli. So behavior in science has a specific meaning. And what it means is an organism's response to some stimulus. Right? Male fiddler crab shows up, other male starts waving his claw. Right? It's the body's or the nervous system, I almost said immune system, nervous system's response to a particular stimulus. And this is an important aspect. Behavior, like every other feature, is subject to natural selection. And this, when we take a little break from lecture, will be something that we'll actually deal with. We'll look at how powerful can natural selection be. All right? Any questions? Cool. You love it, right? You're like, man, I was excited to take AP biology, but I didn't know exactly what it was going to be, and now you're like, I love it, right? It's just fiddler crabs and peacocks and all sorts of other wonderful things. You know what you call the babies? Pea chicks. Did you know that?
No, but it's like okay. If the female is a pea hen, then the baby is being pea chick.
Pea chicks, pea hens, and peacocks. All right. All right. So this is a perfect example of a slide where you don't write down everything you see on the slide. Right? It's not helpful. Okay. But basically, what this is pointing out is that there are 4 big questions, and actually the worksheet that I'll send you home with references these 4 questions often. There are 4 questions that you ask whenever you see an animal behavior or any characteristic in an animal or a plant, any living organism, to try to figure out why. Or the how and the why, actually. The first 2 questions are how. The second 2 questions are why. And so you have this person who by some is considered to be the father of behavioral ecology, Nico Tinbergen. And he asks basically 4 questions about behaviors, but these can be applied to other characteristics as well. So the first question is basically how. How does this behavior happen, right? So with the fiddler crabs, what's triggering that behavior, right? What's the stimulus? Right? Do you see that first part of the question? It's like, what's the stimulus? What's triggering that behavior? And then the second part of the question is just a fancy way of saying, how does the body execute it? So what physiological mechanisms mediate the response? It's just a fancy way of saying, how does the body execute it? So what triggers the behavior? How does the body execute the behavior? Make sense? So let's think back to the male fiddler crab. What structures are going to be associated with a crab waving its claw around like this? Let's just say you're a human waving your hand around like this. What's at work? What parts of your body are working to execute this? Yeah, Mark.
Your shoulders.
Right. So so you've got your skeletal system, right? Your joints are at work waving this around. Your bones are at work waving this around. Good. What else? Yeah.
Your bicep is contracting.
Okay. So muscles are contracting and relaxing, right? Bicep contracting and then relaxing. And as it relaxes, your triceps contracts, right? You've got what are called antagonistic pairs at work. Yeah. Yeah, right? Your nervous system telling your body what to do. So this first question is like, what triggers this behavior? And for me, it's the need to illustrate the fiddler crab claw waving, right? And then what physiological mechanisms mediate that? How does the body execute it? And then the next one, another way to state this is, how does this behavior change through development? Is another way to state the second question. So the second question says, how does the animal's experience during growth and development influence the response? Another way to say it is, how does this behavior change through development? Is it something that only shows up when the animal becomes an adult? Because what you find is in the male fiddler crabs, they probably don't do it until they're adults. Why does that make sense? Yeah.
Because they don't need to attract females.
Right, they don't need to attract females until they're adults. Why else does it make sense?
If your babies don't have time to grow yet.
Yeah, you need time to grow that really impressive claw. Any other ideas of why it probably doesn't appear until they reach adulthood? Yeah.
You're less likely to fight it.
Yeah, you're less likely to fight a male, and you may actually make a male really upset, right? Again, think peacock, and like if you're a juvenile peacock flashing your tail, might upset some other males, right? Probably want to hang out and lay low until you're ready to actually take care of it. So these are the first two questions that Nico Tinbergen asked, and these are questions of how. How does it happen, right? What triggers it? How does the body carry it out? And how does it change through development? We good? Okay. The next two questions are why questions. These are why questions. How does the behavior aid survival and reproduction? So another way to ask this question is, how does this behavior increase fitness? That's a term we're going to use a lot, fitness, and it has a very specific meaning. Okay? So how does the behavior aid survival and reproduction? Another way to say this, how does this behavior increase fitness? And then the fourth question, what is the behavior's evolutionary history? So thinking fiddler crab, do other crabs do the claw waving? Right? Or is this something unique to this species? Or do closely related species also claw wave? All right? So these are the why. First two questions are how. How does the behavior? How does the behavior happen? These are why does the behavior happen? And again, I'm going to give you a worksheet, and it's going to ask you to give examples of these questions. One of them is, I think, on bees, on insect pollination, specifically bees. And so what is a how question? What is a why? We all love bees, right?
No.
Do any of you keep bees?
This is so weird. Like a beekeeper. Weird.
Oh,
When
but
I was
like-
little, I would like
Collect dead bees?
Yeah, I just feel like, oh, they're kind of cool looking. Now I look back and I'm like, what the heck?
It's like trophies of war, right? I mean,
Yeah. I do that.
why would you keep the body armor of conquered foes? I mean, it's just
You should start doing that.
yeah.
Oh wait, can you go back?
Yes, I can actually. Remember, you don't need to write everything on the slides, but absolutely. And just so you know, we're about 14 minutes in. We're getting pretty close to where we're going to take a break for the first time. If you're like, man, I need a break, it's blowing my mind. right? I want to see it. I want to see it in action. Okay. So this is a slide where it's got some key concepts. These are probably new terms for you. A fixed action pattern is probably a term that you've not seen before. And so a fixed action pattern is just another way of thinking about this. It's something the organism does almost robotically, right? It's something the organism does almost robotically. Notice the key here, it's a sequence of unlearned, innate, meaning it's just natural to the organism, that is unchangeable. It's something the organism does robotically. And once initiated, it's carried to completion. They can't stop it, right? It's a very simple behavior. It starts, it runs its course, and it finishes. There are a lot of examples of this in animal behavior. So these are triggered by some external cue, and that external cue is called the sign stimulus. Let's think back to fiddler crabs, the claw waving. Man, I'm really enjoying this. So the claw waving, what do we think? Do we think it's a fixed action pattern? Do we think it's something that they do robotically?
Yes.
Okay, so we've got to vote for yes, we've got to vote for no. I love it. Let's do it. Everybody that says you got to take a vote, take a stand. Everybody that votes yes, raise your hand. Fixed action pattern. That means it's robotic, it's innate. It's just going to happen in response to some sign stimulus. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Wow, we have 13 people in here, so the other 6, let's see if everybody's going to vote. Who says no, that it's not a fixed action pattern? 1, 2, 3. Some people aren't voting.
Because if it's not a fixed action pattern, would that mean that you're that it's if it's not a fixed action pattern, sort of would that be the idea of if it sees a female, it might not wave the claw?
Right, then it's conditional. So the opposite of fixed action pattern is it's conditional. Like it can.
Yeah.
Okay. So the answer is that we don't know for sure, but it looks like it's fixed action pattern. That if adult males are presented with another male or are presented with a female, it's just almost a robotic response. It's a robotic response. Yeah.
If it was fixed, wouldn't it be cute too?
What's that?
If it was fixed.
No, because it can still be a behavior that doesn't happen. So innate behaviors aren't always present all the way through development. Okay? Innate behaviors can still be triggered by something that happens developmentally. Like, so when a male reaches sexual maturity, he'll start to produce testosterone, right? A male sex hormone. And so it can be triggered by that hormone, even though it's innate. So it's still not learned, but it doesn't come until later in life. Yeah.
So like a fixed action pattern is like something that they learn, not something that they just kind of do
No, you can't learn it. It just happens.
Oh.
And so it may not happen until later in development, because what triggers it may be a hormone that isn't produced until you reach sexual maturity.
So like if it was raised alone, like not with anyone else.
It would still do it. It would
Okay.
still do it. Yep. Once it reached sexual maturity. Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, yeah. I forgot about this one. So this is an image right out of the text demonstrating a fixed action pattern. So you have a type of stickleback that when it's presented the color red, it attacks no matter what is colored red. And so what you find is that males are colored red on the bottom, and so it's an innate behavior that actually is really helpful for males to ward off other males, to try to keep control of a certain space within the water. But they'll attack anything that's red. Doesn't matter what its shape is, doesn't matter what it is. If it's red, they attack it. It's a fixed action pattern. It's an innate response to the color red. But it's also one, like the claw waving, that doesn't actually show up until they're sexually mature. Because what triggers them to attack the color red is the release of testosterone, of the male sex hormone. All right? Yeah?
So they attack each other?
Yeah, other males. Yes. The females don't have red on the bottom. So they don't attack females, but they attack other males. And it's because they're and this is fairly common in fishes. By the way, fishes is the correct plural word if there's more than one type. But if there's only one type and a lot of it, it's fish. So if it's like goldfish, if you have 12 goldfish, it's just 12 goldfish. But if your tank has goldfish and cichlids, then it's fishes. Anyways, that's another story for another time.
So you said like they use that to like protect.
Well, they use it to defend a territory.
So
Which is fairly common in fishes. I said fishes and then I stopped to make an aside and I never finished explaining that. So what's common in fishes is that the males will defend a territory. And then the males will set up a nest. The females will come and lay their eggs in the nest, and then the males will fertilize them. And so it's fairly common in fishes, especially freshwater fishes, is for males to defend a territory, a stretch of sediment at the bottom of the body of water. And it may be just slightly bigger than the fish itself. Like you'll see this commonly. Any of you fish bass, like smallmouth, largemouth bass? None of you? None of you fish? It's right. We live in Southern California. Like if you want to go to a lake, you gotta drive a while and there's 40,000 people there. How am I gonna fish it?
I used to like fish with my grandma.
Yeah. So largemouth and smallmouth bass aren't actually bass. We call them bass, but they aren't bass. They're sunfish. And sunfish all do this. So there's like bluegill, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, pumpkin seed sunfish, all sorts of wonderful things. And the males will defend. Sometimes you'll have 50 males in a space this big, and they're defending a piece of land just as big as their body. But it's enough that they can have a nest of females to come lay their eggs, that then they can fertilize and keep other males from eating. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they do. They attack anything red, and males happen to be red on the bottom. All right. It's time to illustrate something real quick. So let me pause this. I don't need. So the recording is going again. So if you say something really loud, it will pick up your voice, and you will be on YouTube. So. All right. So picking up. Back to talking about behaviors, there's another very specific, there's a word that we see all the time, but in biology has a very specific meaning, and that's the word communication. So communication has a very specific meaning in biology, and what its meaning is it's the transmission and reception of signals. And it's just, I don't know, it's sad, I think, to define communication that way. But a signal is any behavior that triggers another animal's behavior. Back to the fiddler crab, right? Fiddler crab. So this, even though, this is a wonderful thing, even though the behavior may be a fixed action pattern. What does that mean again? Yeah.
Something innate that it just does automatically.
Yeah, it does. It's robotic. Once it starts, it can't stop until the stimulus is taken away. But let's say we're still this claw waving in the male fiddler crab. If it elicits some response from the female, it is communication, even though it's a fixed action pattern, right? They're communicating even if they're not thinking in any way about that communication. It's robotic, right? Male sees female fiddler crab, male waves claw. Female sees claw waving, female responds in some way, right? And so it's fixed probably on both parties, or by both parties, but they're still communicating. All right, does that make sense? Okay, so communication again has a very specific meaning in biology. And then the signal is any behavior that elicits some response from another individual. So forms of animal communication. They can be visual, they can be chemical, they can be tactile, they can be auditory. And so visual cues, those are fairly obvious, right? Back to the fiddler crab. Now I think I'm just going to have to keep this going, like all year. All year. Just keep bringing back that example, the male fiddler crab.
Our friend the fiddler crab.
So visual cues work really nicely, assuming you can actually transmit them over a long distance, right? Crabs live on beaches, there's not a lot in the way. Visual cues are pretty good. Underwater, visual cues are not very good because light does not move well underwater. I don't know if you know that or not, but you've probably had the experience of being under a swimming pool and under the water in a swimming pool, not under a swimming pool, but underwater inside of a swimming pool. And it's very difficult to see 10, 15 feet away from you, right? So visual cues do not work great underwater. Chemical cues don't work great underwater either because they diffuse inside of water, right? But auditory signals work really well. Sound travels really well underwater, right? You know, whales can communicate over hundreds of miles. So you can have whales separated by 300 miles and they're all part of the same group actively communicating together. Unless, of course, a ship gets in the way and blocks the sound or transmits more sound and confuses them. And then the whales end up swimming up on beaches. It's very sad. Tactile cues work well as long as you can get in close proximity to the person you're communicating with. You see, these tactile are mostly in learned behaviors, where it's like you have to take somebody and physically teach them something. All right? Make sense? Okay, so here's an example for you. Fruit fly courtship. And so this is males attracting females. Fruit fly courtship follows a 3-step stimulus response chain. So stimulus would be the signal, the response would now make it communication, right? You got a signal and a response. We good? Okay. So here's the 3-step response. Here's step 1. Male identifies a female of the same species and moves towards her. Okay? Not necessarily getting closer to her, but faces her. Okay? And then here are some of the communication, chemical communication. The female's releasing some kind of chemicals. What's the term I'm looking for? Pheromones. Thank you. Releasing pheromones, and the males notice that the female is present. Visual communication, right? The male sees her and then orients his body. Look at this. The female didn't do anything except for show up. And so her behavior is her presence, and it elicits some response from the male, right? And so you're like, how is that communication? And that's, you have to keep in mind, communication means something very specific in biology. There's some signal, and then there's some response to that. And the female's presence is the signal. Like, wow, this is really sophisticated communication. They're fruit flies. They live like 3 days as adults. Like, how sophisticated of communication are they going to accomplish? Not much. You know fruit flies, right? The genus is Drosophila. They're teeny tiny little. Did you all do a Drosophila lab in bio?
No.
Oh, we will do a Drosophila lab. And you know what's awesome? Is if you're not really careful, the fruit flies will get out and they will overwhelm this entire building. It'll be awesome.
That's awesome. Cancel school.
When we let them out, it's only over there. Basically,
Yeah.
our room's fine and everything else is overrun by them.
All right. So step 2, right? This is a signal cascade. Now the communication is going to get a little bit more sophisticated. Male alerts the female to his presence in 2 ways. Chemical communication. He now identifies the female's identity. Okay, so now he starts to release some pheromones that the female can respond to. And you're like, why is this? Well, there are a lot of really closely related fruit fly species. But if they're not the same species, they're not going to be able to form offspring. Okay? And then also tactile communication. Taps the female with one of his forelegs. So tactile communication works if you can get into close proximity. Step 3. Male produces a courtship song to inform the female of his species. Sings a species-specific song, auditory communication. If all 3 steps are successful, the female will allow the male to copulate. Okay? And then now at this point, you've had a 3-step communication sequence with signal, response, signal, response, signal, response, and now you can make more fruit flies. Which will be wonderful for you because we're going to do a fruit fly lab, and if you don't make any offspring, your lab is going to fail. And nobody wants that. Not like fail, get an F grade, but fail like it won't work. Okay? Yeah, I mean, that's it. You know, so chemistry labs, they're more predictable, right? Unless you do something really unpredictable, like sometimes this reaction works, sometimes it doesn't. But when you're doing labs with animals, sometimes they just don't do what they're supposed to do. It's the nature of working with. All right. So here's this 3-step communication cascade. Male notices female. Male approaches female, male sings to female. If all goes well, you get baby fruit flies. All right? Honeybees. Honeybees, another example of communication. And again, communication has a very specific meaning in biology. And what does that mean?
Transmission and reception of signal.
Yeah, so one individual sends a signal, another individual responds in some way to that signal. And remember, the signal can be as simple as you show up, right? And your presence is a signal. Honeybees are very sophisticated animals. And so they have probably one of the most well-studied communication cascades in all of insects. And it's how they communicate the location of a new food source. Okay? So, I don't know if you knew this or not, but honeybees, all of the bees in the hive are female. They're all daughters of the queen. Okay, and then you have the queen. The queen will produce male offspring at the very beginning, like right when she starts her rule, just in order to fertilize her eggs, and then all of the males will get kicked out of the hive. And the males are called drones, and then they'll get kicked out of the hive, and they'll feed for a little bit, and then they'll die. But the female workers, the daughters, they all stick around, and sometimes they'll live for years, and what they do is they run the hive. And it's not like, so say in termites, have you all seen like soldier termites versus worker termites? We'll see a lot of these examples. Soldier termites are massive, huge individuals, like so big that it looks like they're a completely different species. And then the worker termites are small and they just, eat wood and make food for the queen and other individuals. And so in there, the different jobs are carried out based on different individuals because of differences in morphology, differences in structure. In bees, usually as an individual learns, it will transition from one job to a different job. Okay? But the worker bees, some of those worker bees go out and they find food. They collect pollen, they collect nectar to bring back to feed to the larvae, feed to the queen, feed to the other workers. But they execute a really sophisticated dance in order to communicate the location. Inside of the beehive, it is dark. It's pitch black. Okay? And so when they dance, other bees have to feel how they're dancing to know where these hives are. So look, first thing they'll do is basically orient their body in the direction of wherever the location of food is. Okay? And they will execute basically a figure eight dance, and this midline will point in the direction of where the food source is. And the size of these circles will oftentimes illustrate how far away the food source is. Like, that's pretty cool. So like here they're pointing in the direction of A. Here their heads face in the opposite direction, so it's still on the same plane, but now the food source is on the other side of the hive. But look when they add a third. In a third one, they orient their bodies at a particular angle to how they oriented it before. So here head up, right? You see? Head up in A, head up in C, an illustration that A and C are on the same side of the hive, which they are. And then look at the angle. This straight line, which is part of their figure eight, is at a 30-degree angle to where it was when they were dancing the location of A. And when you go out and you measure the angle between A and C, it's 30 degrees. And so they have a very sophisticated way of communicating where the food is. And why would they go through this trouble? Why don't they just bring back food? Why would they go through this trouble of telling other workers where the food source is? Yeah, Mark.
So more workers could get the food.
Absolutely, right? Many hands make light labor, is how the saying goes, right? That makes sense? A bee is a small animal, would you agree? You're like, well, they're not that small, right? They're big enough that I can see them and they freak me out. But they're fairly small animals, so they are limited in the amount of material that they can carry. And you know what's cool? So some people did a study and they're like, I want to know if the amount that a female bee carries impacts how long they live. So they started putting little weights on the female bees that were flying outside of the hive going to find food. And the more weight they put on the bees, the lower the life expectancy of the female. And so they're limited by how much they work, which makes sense, right? If they work really hard, they're not going to live as long. You know, like, is that also true for humans? You can come back to there. All right, so here's worker bees. Here's the route dance. So this is a really crazy dance to show that the food is really, really close. Okay? And then here, back to the dance of just showing different locations of where the food is. All right, any questions here? So these are all communication. Communication has a very specific meaning in biology. What is it? Reception and transmission of signals. Signal is a behavior that triggers some response, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So pheromones, we've already I mentioned this. This is a chemical communication. Okay. Here's an example. We're going to move through this real quickly. But yeah, I mean, you can find some really interesting examples of chemical stimuli. A good example of this, wolves, right? Wolves will go to the edges of their territory and they will, quote, mark their territory, right? Have you heard that before? And then dogs will do it, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're marking their territory by leaving a chemical signal to other individuals that this territory belongs to me. Any of you have like a really young sibling? Like young enough that they were a baby and you remember them being a baby? Okay. Do you have a dog? Did your dog start to mark its territory when baby was born? A lot of times you'll see this, especially in male dogs that aren't fixed. If a new baby enters the house, they'll start marking their territory because they start to feel that pressure. And that's exactly what they're trying to do, right? They're communicating chemically. Although usually the response that they get is not ideal for the dog, right? All right. Oh, yeah. This is good stuff. Okay. So let me talk a little bit more. We're not actually gonna have a time to do a third set. I thought we would, but that's fine because we're gonna cover maybe 2 or 3 more minutes of slides, and then I have a simulation that I want to walk us through. All right. So moving into the second section of 51, this is all about innate versus learned behavior. Are these fixed action patterns, right, that they're pretty much robotic, or is there a conditional response, right, where the animal can choose how it responds? So innate behavior, synonymous with fixed action pattern, it's robotic, right? It's just once they start it, they're going to carry it to completion. There's not a lot of variation. But again, remember, like with the fiddler crab, right? It may not show up until they reach sexual maturity, right? And so it's like, was this learned? Well, no, it's triggered by the sex hormones. Now, what you find is that a lot of animals have some degree of learned behavior. Now, some animals have a lot of learned behavior, but most animals have at least some degree of learned behavior. And the best way to test whether it's a learned behavior versus an innate behavior is, Tori, this was your question, right? You said, so if they were raised completely separate of other fiddler crabs, will they still do it? Or was that you, Isabel? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Isabel, for giving Tori credit for that. So, and this is the best way to actually study whether it's learned or it's innate. Raise them separate from individuals of their species. And then if they still do it once they reach sexual maturity, then you know it's an innate behavior. It's a fixed action pattern. Okay, it's something that's going to happen. They don't have to learn it. So you call these cross-fostering studies, where you have an animal that is not the same species raise an individual. So a lot of this work has been done with birds. Birds have a high level of parental care typically. Typically both mom and dad care for the chicks. And so the birds tend to be wired in such a way that the first thing they see, they associate as their parent. Which is nice if you're doing work with birds and you are there when they hatch, they now associate you as being their parent and they follow you and they learn your behaviors. And then so you know, is this something that's innate or is it something that's learned? So the example given in the text, or one of the examples given in the text, is white-footed versus California mice. White-footed mice are very aggressive mice. California mice are less aggressive. And so what they wanted to figure out is if they raise California mice with white-footed mice parents, do they learn to be more aggressive? Here are the data. So here are the data presented in a table. So California mice fostered, oh no, it's the, I told you the exact opposite. I lied to you. California mice are aggressive. White-footed mice are not aggressive. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to lie to you, but I have no excuse. All right? So California mice, aggressive. White-footed mice, non-aggressive. I should know this because I catch white-footed mice all the time in Michigan. Anyways, it's another story for another time. So when you raise California mice with white-footed mice, so again, remember California mice are the aggressive species. You raise them with less aggressive parents, and you actually get reduced aggression in the offspring, right, that are raised with less aggressive parents. When you raise white-footed mice by California male parents, you get increased aggression in a neutral setting and no difference in aggression to an intruder. And so what you find is that a lot of this aggressive behavior is actually learned. They learn it from their parents. It's not innate. It's not programmed. Yeah?
How would it show aggressiveness in a neutral situation?
So in a neutral, if they're out away from the den. So in terms of aggression towards an intruder, this is if some other individual enters into the den. Okay? In a neutral situation is outside of the den, maybe when they're foraging, and they run across another individual. Do they demonstrate aggression? That's a good question. Did you have that same question, Mark?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? And so this is a wonderful way to actually test whether it's an innate or a learned behavior. And there are some of these studies done in humans, and they do it with twins. And so there were a lot of these studies going on through the 1980s and 1990s, and your textbook will talk a little bit about this, where twins that were put up for adoption were deliberately given to separate parents, unbeknownst to the adopting parents or to the kids growing up. And so there was actually a huge amount of lawsuits that started happening with this adoption agency once a lot of this came to light, but it actually provided a great deal of data on human behavior of learned versus innate, right? If you've got identical twins, they have the same exact DNA. So any differences in how they behave then should be a product of their different environments and not a product of the actual genetic makeup. And this we'll talk about more in a little bit, not today, but we'll talk about in future lessons, how much of human behavior is actually genetically based. All right, any questions? Got a simulation we're going to walk through, and I'm going to present you 3 different pools and the observations that you make. Have you all work in the same groups that you worked with your beads and come up with a research question and come up with a hypothesis, and then we'll run through some simulations. So are there any questions about this or anything else from 51? Are we okay? All right. So we'll stop this.